They say you forget the pain first, that the mind scrubs the agony to keep you sane, but I remember the smell. That never leaves. It wasn't the rot of the battlefield, not for me, not then. It was the smell of hot, sheared metal and sulfurized cutting oil. It hung over Essen like a shroud, a thick, greasy fog that tasted of copper when you swallowed. I can still feel the grit of it between my teeth if I close my eyes. I was 29, a man made of calluses and silence, standing at the altar of the Krupp Works, worshipping a god I had come to hate. I suppose I should tell you what I was before the world went mad. I was a machinist. That word doesn't carry the weight it used to. Today men push buttons and watch screens. Back then, we felt the tolerance in our fingertips. I could run a hand over a crankshaft and tell you if it was 3 microns out of true. It was a language of absolutes. Steel didn't lie. Gears didn't have politics. If you cut the thread right, the bolt held. If you didn't, it failed. There was a comfort in that, a terrible, seductive order in a world that was rapidly losing its shape. My station was in Hall 4, a cavernous belly of noise where we birthed the hearts of the Tiger tanks. The Maybach HL-230 engines. Beautiful, monstrous things. 700 horsepower of precision engineering designed to crush Europe into dust. I stood there shift after shift, 12 hours at a stretch, my hands moving with the practiced rhythm of a factory worker, while my mind tried to run away. That was the trick, you see. You had to separate the man from the hands. The hands were loyal to the Reich. They filed, they measured, they lubricated. The man was somewhere else. Usually I was back in the kitchen with Greta, my little sister. She would have been 20 then. I'd think about the way she laughed when she beat me at cards, or the way the morning light used to hit the flower boxes on our windowsill before the cold dust turned everything gray. But those memories were dangerous. They were soft, and you couldn't be soft in the works. The fear wasn't a sharp thing, not like a bayonet. It was a dull, heavy pressure, like deep water. It started when the Steiners disappeared from the apartment below us. One night they were arguing about the price of butter, and the next morning their door was standing open, swinging in the draft. No one said a word. We just walked past the open door, heads down, eyes on the pavement. That was the rule. You survive by being invisible. You survive by being a cog. I tried to apply the logic of the lathe to the war. I told myself that if I just kept my head down, if I stayed within the tolerances, if I didn't vibrate or squeak, they wouldn't replace me. They wouldn't look at Greta. I was essential. A skilled machinist was worth 10 infantrymen, the foreman used to say. But the logic was failing. I could see it in the eyes of the men on the line. We were all terrified, looking for the flaw in the metal, the crack that would shatter us. That Tuesday was it a Tuesday. The days all bled into one long gray shift. The foreman, Mueller, stood behind me for a long time. I could feel his gaze on the back of my neck, heavier than the heat from the furnaces. Mueller was a true believer, a man who wore his party pin like a religious icon. He didn't know a micrometer from a meat grinder, but he knew how to spot hesitation. I was turning a piston sleeve. The lathe hummed a low, steady vibration that traveled up my arms and settled in my chest. I didn't look up. To look up was to invite a question, and questions were fatal. I focused on the ribbon of steel curling away from the cutting tool. Blue and smoking. Precision, Richter, Mueller barked over the din. His voice was thin, ready, barely audible over the thumping of the drop hammers. The fatherland requires perfection. I nodded, not breaking the rhythm. Jowl, he lingered a moment longer, his boots scraping on the concrete, then moved on to harass the apprentice at the next station. I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. My hands were slick with sweat inside my gloves. It was during the lunch break, a 20-minute window where we huddled in the corner of the yard, eating bread that tasted like sawdust, that the world shifted. I went to my locker to retrieve my flask of tea. It was a narrow, rusted metal box, my only private space in the entire city. I opened the door, the hinges groaning in protest. Tucked inside the rim of my micrometer case, where only a man obsessed with his tools would look, was a scrap of paper. My heart hammered against my ribs. a chaotic, irregular rhythm that had nothing to do with machinery. I didn't pull it out immediately. I checked the aisle. Empty. I reached in, my fingers trembling, and palmed the paper, crushing it into a ball. I turned my back to the room, pretending to inspect a caliper, and unfolded it just enough to see. It wasn't a letter. It was a schematic, a rough hand-drawn diagram of the engine block I was working on, with a specific oil channel circled in red. Below it, a single line of text, written in a code I had memorized but never dared to use. The bear, ice bear, the resistance cell I had foolishly, desperately signaled to months ago. In a moment of drunken grief after seeing a transport train filled with hollow faces, I thought they had forgotten me. I prayed they had forgotten me. I looked at the schematic, then at the photograph taped to the back of the locker door. Greta, she was smiling, holding a stray cat we'd found. If I did this, if I sabotaged the line, I wasn't just risking my own neck. I was risking hers. The Gestapo didn't just take the sinner. They took the family. They pulled the whole root system out of the ground. The siren wailed, signaling the end of the break. It was a mournful, rising scream that set my teeth on edge. I stood there, suspended between the safety of the machine and the terror of the man. The paper burned in my palm. I could throw it in the furnace. I could go back to the lathe, turn the sleeves, build the engines, and let the tanks roll east. I could stay a cog. But then I remembered the Steiner's open door. I remembered the silence of the neighbors, and I looked at the engine parts on the bench, waiting to be assembled. They weren't just metal anymore. They were the reason the doors kept opening. I shoved the paper into my boot and slammed the locker shut. The transition from cowardice to action isn't a fanfare. It's a sickness. I felt ill as I walked back to the floor. The noise of the factory, usually a comfort, now felt like an assault. The rhythmic thumping wasn't the heartbeat of industry anymore. It was the marching of boots. I didn't meet the mentor in a tavern or a dark alley. My mentor was the machine itself. I knew these engines. I knew them better than the men who designed them, because I knew where they hurt. I knew that a machine is a delicate balance of stresses, a negotiation between heat and friction. If you violate that treaty, the whole thing tears itself apart. That night back in my small, freezing apartment, I didn't sleep. I sat at the table with the blackout curtains drawn, staring at the wall. The silence of the city was heavy, broken only by the distant rumble of flak guns testing their range. I wasn't Klaus the factory worker anymore. I was something else, a wrench thrown into the gears. I had to invert my entire life's training. For 20 years, I had learned how to make things run smooth, cool, and true. Now I had to learn how to make them die. And I had to do it in a way that looked like an accident. That was the art of it. If the engine failed on the test stand, they would blame me. If it failed 300 miles away, in the mud of the Eastern Front, they would blame the Russian winter. I needed materials, not explosives. I wasn't a soldier. I was a mechanic. I needed something subtle, a contaminant. The next shift was the graveyard. The factory at night was a different beast. Shadows stretched long and distorted between the pools of yellow electric light. The air was cooler, but the smell was stronger, the oil fumes settling low to the floor. I moved with the ghost-like efficiency of a man who knows every rivet of his cage. I had a small vial of carborundum powder, abrasive grit used for grinding, hidden in the lining of my glove. It was fine, like gray flour. The engines were lined up on the assembly trestles, waiting for the cylinder heads to be torqued down. Mueller was in his office, the glass frosted with grime, likely sleeping or drinking schnapps. The other men were zombies, moving in a trance of exhaustion. I approached the block I had been assigned. It was cold to the touch. I looked around. The crane overhead rattled as it passed, momentarily drowning out the world. In that second of mechanical roaring, I acted. I didn't sprinkle the powder. That was too obvious. I dipped my gloved finger into the vial, picking up a trace amount of the grit, and ran it along the bearing surface of the crankshaft. Just a smear, invisible to the eye. But under the heat and pressure of combustion, that grit would wake up. It would score the soft metal of the bearing. It would create friction. The oil would break down. The rod would seize, and the heart of the tiger would stop beating. I did it again and again. 3 engines, 3 death sentences signed with a dirty finger. The tension was a physical pain, a cramp in my stomach that wouldn't let go. Every time a tool clattered to the floor, I flinched. Every time a shadow moved in the periphery, I thought it was the black coats. I was rewriting the code of my existence. I was unmaking the parts I had spent a lifetime learning to make. It was terrifying. It was exhilarating. I logged the work in the ledger. My handwriting didn't shake. I marveled at that. The lie looked exactly like the truth. For weeks, nothing happened. The engines were crated and shipped out on the rail lines, disappearing into the maw of the war. I went to work. I came home. I ate soup with Greta and tried not to look at the door. The waiting was a slow suffocation. Had I used enough grit? Had I used too much? Would they catch it at the final inspection? I started to see spies everywhere. The grocer who gave me an extra potato, was he testing me? The old woman who watched from her window, was she writing down my comings and goings? The paranoia was a parasite, eating the logic I prized so much. Then came the morning the rhythm broke. It started with the sirens. Not the air raid sirens, we knew that song by heart. This was the factory alarm, a staccato, frantic burst that signaled a fire or a critical accident. But there was no smoke. I was at my lathe, the coolant splashing over my knuckles. The power to the machines was cut abruptly. The hum died. The silence that rushed in was louder than the noise had ever been. It was the silence of a held breath. The heavy steel doors at the far end of Hall 4 groaned open. They didn't walk. They swarmed. A convoy of black vehicles tore onto the factory floor, tires screeching on the oil-stained concrete. Men in long leather coats spilled out before the cars even stopped moving. They moved with a predatory speed, their boots striking the floor with a sound that echoed like gunshots. Gestapo. The foreman Mueller was running toward them, waving his clipboard, looking small and pathetic against the wall of black leather. I saw him point, not at a specific man, but at the line. My line. I froze. My hand was still resting on the wheel of the lathe. I could feel the residual warmth of the machine. I looked at the man next to me, an old-timer named Hans. He looked back, his face the color of ash. Hey, no, we all knew. One of the officers, a tall man with a scar running through his eyebrow, stepped onto a crate. He didn't shout. He didn't have to. Halt, the word hung in the dead air. I gripped the cold steel of the lathe wheel. The grit was gone, sent east, but the crime remained. I calculated the distance to the side exit, 30 meters past the stamping press. Impossible. The officer began to walk down the line, looking at each of us in turn. He was hunting, and I was the prey standing in the open field. The ordinary world was gone. The unmaking had begun. The officer stopped 3 stations away. He wasn't looking at faces anymore. He was checking the roster Mueller held in shaking hands. Every name was a sentence. Every pause was an execution. I watched Mueller. He was a good man once. He had given me extra bread when my mother died. Now he was sweating through his collar. The officer tapped the clipboard with a gloved finger. Mueller hesitated. The officer's hand went to his holster. It was a subtle movement, a promise of violence. Mueller broke. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. He just raised a trembling arm. His finger wavered in the stale air, drifting past hands, past the stamping press, until it settled on me. The air left the room. Richter, the officer barked. The sound of my own name was like a physical blow. The illusion of the worker, the loyal citizen, the machinist, it all shattered. I was no longer a part of the machine. I was the grit. 2 soldiers stepped forward, their boots heavy on the oil-slicked floor. They were young. They looked bored. To them, I was just another quota to fill. I looked at the lathe. Then I looked past it to the main steam conduit running vertically up the brick wall. It was an old pipe, rusted at the seams, carrying superheated vapor to the hammers in the next hall. I had reported the stress fractures a week ago. They had ignored me. Efficiency over safety. That was the Reich's way. No, it was my weapon. I didn't raise my hands. I reached into my overalls. Halt, the officer shouted. He drew his Luger. The bore looked like a cannon tunnel. I didn't pull a gun. I pulled a heavy monkey wrench, the steel warm from my body heat. I didn't lunge at them. I spun around, putting the heavy cast iron body of the lathe between us. I swung the wrench with every ounce of fear and hatred I possessed. Not at the men, at the valve assembly on the conduit. Iron met iron. The sound was a dull, sickening crack. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. The officer leveled his pistol. I saw his knuckle whiten on the trigger. Then the world turned white. The pipe didn't just leak. It screamed, a wall of superheated steam, pressurized to 600 pounds per square inch, erupted into the hall. It was a blinding, scalding fog that expanded instantly, swallowing the light, the soldiers, and the air itself. I heard screaming. I didn't know if it was the soldiers or the workers. I didn't know if I had just boiled my friends alive to save my own skin. I dropped to the floor, crawling on my belly, under the scalding cloud. I knew this floor. I knew every crack in the concrete, every vibration of the foundation. I moved by touch, by instinct. The heat pressed down on me, a heavy, wet blanket trying to suffocate the life out of me. Bullets cracked blindly above my head, sparking against the machinery. They were shooting at ghosts. I found the maintenance hatch behind the stamping press. I wrestled it open, burning my fingers on the iron wheel, and fell into the darkness of the cable run. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The screaming followed me down into the earth. I ran until my lungs burned worse than the steam. I ran until the darkness of the tunnels turned into the gray light of a sewer grate near the river. I climbed out, covered in filth, gasping for air that tasted of ash and rot. Essen was burning in the distance. The RAF had visited the night before, but the fire inside me was colder. I stripped off my overalls, the blue fabric stained with grease and the sweat of a life I could never go back to. I threw them into the Ruhr River. I watched them sink. Klaus Richter, the machinist, drowned in that black water. What emerged was something else. I lived in the cellars after that, in the bombed-out skeletons of houses where families used to eat Sunday dinner. I slept on piles of rubble, clutching a stolen pistol, waiting for a knock that never came because I had no door. I reconnected with the cell 3 weeks later. They looked at me differently. I wasn't just the mechanic who could fix a radio anymore. I was the man who had turned the Krupp Works into a slaughterhouse to escape. They didn't ask how I got out. They saw the burns on my neck. They saw the emptiness in my eyes. We sabotaged rail lines. We cut phone wires. We did small, ugly things in the dark that slowed the beast down by inches. But I never went back to a factory. I couldn't touch a machine without feeling the vibration of that pipe, without hearing the hiss of judgment. Decades fade the sharp edges of memory. They say, they lie. I sit here in my shop now. It is quiet. The war has been over for 40 years. There are no sirens, no Gestapo, just the smell of sawdust and old oil. I look at my hands. They are spotted with age, shaking slightly, but they are still the hands of a machinist. I hold a gear from an old clock I am repairing. It is stripped, useless. I never found out who was standing in that cloud. Hans Mueller, the young boys from the village who worked the line. Did they burn? Did they suffocate in the white fog I unleashed? I told myself it was necessary. I told myself it was war. But war is just a word we use to excuse the things we do to survive. The machine of the state was broken, yes, but we were the cogs. And when you break the machine, you crush the cogs. I am not a hero. I am a man who broke a pipe. They tell you of the great battles, the armies, the flags. But war is also fought in silence, in the choices of one person, in one moment. The real cost is not what is destroyed, but what you must become to survive. You must choose to act, knowing you may never be forgiven, not even by yourself. That is the price of not being a bystander. This memory is a shard of glass I carry. Help me pull it out. Subscribe to keep this history alive.